I got a letter here and I'd like to share it. Dear Mr. Peterson, thank you for your letter of January 25th, inviting me to reflect on my experience as a law clerk to Justice Jackson in the early 50s. Justice Jackson was a delightful person to have as an employer. I think he probably relied less on his law clerks for drafting opinions than some of his colleagues did. I think each of his 2 law clerks were assigned a couple of court opinions to draft, not because he felt the need for any help, but so that they could have that experience. I remember only one occasion on which he showed considerable irritation with me, and I think he had every right to show it. In those days, the justices held their weekly conferences on Saturday, and after the conferences were over and the justices had left the building, some of us law clerks played basketball upstairs. I had developed the habit, without ever asking him, of using his private shower after basketball games. You're ahead of me now. One Saturday afternoon, I stepped out of the shower with only a towel around my waist, only to see him and a couple of his friends from upstate New York standing at the entrance to his chambers. I profusely apologized, and after a few days, our relations were back to normal. Though there was considerable criticism of the Nuremberg trials at the time that Jackson served as the chief prosecutor for the United States, I think that later developments have muted much of this criticism. He used an elegant writing style in his opinions, which could be a model for all appellate judges. And his concurring opinion in the Steele seizure cases has been later validated through its adoption by the full court. Enjoy your day. Sincerely, William Rehnquist. William Rehnquist was a junior clerk for Justice Jackson, and we're going to introduce the senior clerk at the time, who will be our speaker tonight. We're privileged to have George Niebank, Jr., born in Niagara Falls, New York, moved to Jamestown about 1931. His parents were George Niebank and Rose Murphy. His father was a banker for many years and president of the Bank of Jamestown for, I believe, 20 years. George was educated in the Jamestown public schools, attending Euclid and Lincoln, went to secondary school. Secondary school was at a private school back east. You wouldn't tell me which one. Then off to Yale, where he was the class of 1947, and he graduated from the University of Buffalo Law School in 1950, where he will be going this weekend to attend his 50th law school reunion. He was in the Navy during World War II for 33 months. And then after he graduated from law school, and because of relationship with family members, and a stellar career in law school, he was given the great privilege of being asked as clerk for Justice Jackson. That was in the October term of 1950. In the spring part of that term, a guy named Rehnquist shows up, and according to a book which I have out in the front foyer of the Supreme Court, written by William Rehnquist, which I would commend to you, there are a tremendous amount of references to our speaker, George Niebank, and how Chief Justice Rehnquist relied on George just to walk him around, to show him the ropes, and for that he's been eternally grateful. And as I understand it, George taught Justice Rehnquist everything he knew about the court and constitutional law. That's what it says here. After 2 years on the court, he was called back into the Navy. This was during the Korean War, but instead he was appointed as a commissioner of the then new U.S. Court of Military Appeals. Shortly thereafter, he had an opportunity to be counsel to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroads, where he was there for 29 years, and retired in 1982 with the office of Senior Vice President. He had underneath him 55 salaried attorneys, and there were 5 offices throughout the country. I won't bore you with a lot more of the details, but George Niebank has one terrific career. Has 4 children, wife who recently passed away, and I can't say how thrilled I am that we have today in our presence the former law clerk of Robert Jackson, George Niebank. George?
Thank you, Greg, for that most generous introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You have no idea how much I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this evening. I also appreciate your courteous invitation to my sister-in-law, Joanne Niebank, so that she could be here. One of the reasons I'm so pleased to be here is that, notwithstanding that most of the past 50 years, my contacts with Jamestown have been through brief visits, I still regard Jamestown and Chautauqua County as home. When people ask me where I'm from, I tell them, well, I spent my adult life in Chicago, which we dearly loved, but that I am really from Jamestown, New York, and that's home. Maybe the proof in the long run is that I expect to spend eternity in Sunset Hill, but I'm in no rush for that. You very nearly missed me. It's a good thing I read the morning paper, because there the reporter commented on the fact that the dinner this evening was to be here at the Athenaeum in Chautauqua. And I thought, good Lord, how did she make that mistake? It's not going to be at the Athenaeum in Chautauqua, it's going to be at Moonbrook Country Club. So I thought, well, no, maybe she's right. But the only advice I had from someone who will remain nameless was that it was to be Moonbrook. So I called him up on the phone and said, well, how about this? Where is the meeting? And he, of course, confirmed that it was here. And in a way, that's unfortunate, because the early parts of my material that I put together for this evening were tied to Moonbrook Country Club. And so we're just going to have to pass a couple of those. But one of them, I don't think I will pass. But it is golf related, and I know there are a few golfers here in the room this evening. Where I live in Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, and as you may know, we have a great deal of golf there. And I have played a good deal, but most of the men and women make up various foursomes with which they play regularly. And I mean, like every Tuesday at 10 a.m. they play with one group, and then Thursday at 11 they play with another group. But there was one group of old duffers who've been playing together for years, and they had become close friends. One of their number, Charlie, suddenly and unexpectedly lost his wife. And they felt very badly about that, and they consoled Charlie as best they could, but they continued their golf games, of course. Then, much to their surprise, in only a few months, Charlie had remarried a much younger woman, and they didn't know anything about her. They didn't know what she looked like or anything. So they didn't say anything about this, biding their time till he would bring some report to them about his bride. Well, weeks passed, and he didn't say a word. Well, I couldn't stand it any longer, so one day we undertook to ask him some questions. One of them said, well, now, Charlie, your new young wife, she must be quite pretty, right? Charlie said, no. As a matter of fact, she's kind of plain. Well, I'll bet that she's a good cook. Well, no, I don't know about that because we always eat out. So then they said, well, the loving must be pretty good, right, Charlie? He said, well, can't say that either. because we haven't tried yet. Well, they said almost in unison, Charlie, if your bride is not very good looking, you don't know whether she cooks, and there's no loving, why did you ever marry her? Because she can drive after dark. Mr. Justice Jackson would have liked that story, although he had nothing to do with golf. I don't believe that he ever had a golf club in his hand, as far as I know. He loved a good story. He was a genuine raconteur and really an inveterate storyteller. It was my great pleasure, as you have heard, not only to come to know him very well personally, but also to be able to work very closely with him for 2 years, and then to maintain contact with him after my service at the court was concluded, from then until the time of his death. He died too young, after only about 15 years in the court. Now, he did leave his mark on the court, but surely not the mark he would have left had he lived to serve 15 or 20 more years. It is certainly fitting that you have chosen to memorialize Robert H. Jackson on this occasion marking the centennial of the Jamestown Bar Association. Jamestown and Chautauqua County have had, and doubtless still has, some outstanding lawyers. But I dare say that he was, by all odds, the most outstanding member of the Jamestown and Chautauqua County, it's Jamestown Bar in Chautauqua County, in the 20th century. I think it's unlikely that we'll ever see his likes again. It's not that we are incapable of producing another in his mold, but if such a person came into this world today, he or she would not evolve as he did. And to a certain extent, it affected also other attorneys of his era. Times and conditions have changed so dramatically as, I believe, to preclude the development or the nurturing of another Robert H. Jackson. 20 years or so ago, we had a reunion dinner of Jackson clerks in Washington. You can imagine that the conversation ranged far and wide. But we finally focused our attention on this fundamental question: what made Robert H. Jackson tick? I would like to be able to report that we were able to produce a nice consensus among the group so that we could go away with a package which I could now pass on to you about what made Robert H. Jackson tick. But that was not quite the way it worked out. It is not that there was substantial disagreement among us. There wasn't that substantial disagreement. But each of the 24 former clerks there, had a bit of a spin of his own on Justice Jackson. All agreed that he was a special and unique man, and there were varying views about how he came to be that way. In retrospect, I now believe we had the trouble we did simply because we could not relate to or comprehend the forces that made him what he was. My own view is that Robert H. Jackson was consumed by the law. It was the cornerstone of his life. And this was possible, I believe, because he was a product of a different time, to which I've already adverted a bit. The law could consume him because there were not the other attractions with which we live. Distractions might be a better word. Perhaps the leading attraction, looking at it in those terms, I would say is television. Let's face it, is television with the world spread out before us each night, with the 6 o'clock news, with CNN, C-SPAN, CNBC, and so forth. That's what we have. He, of course, knew nothing of that type of thing. Nor was he confronted with the communication facilities that we now take for granted. He was from an era in which people actually sent telegrams or affixed 3-cent stamps to letters. Speaking about telegrams, he was dictating a telegram to his secretary one day. He was to meet a man in Schenectady. So he said, tell whoever it was that I'll meet him in Schenectady at 3 p.m. She said, well, how do you spell that? He said, well, S-C-H-S, oh hell, tell him to meet me in Utica. He knew nothing of the travel facilities that are available to us today. When he went to California from Washington in the summer of 1954, he went by train with his doctor all the way from Washington to California, all the way back. He liked it. He was in no rush, and that was a very nice time to travel by train. The trains were still good then. And of course he had no hint of the age of the personal computer and the internet. I imagine he would have had a good deal of trouble with the computer and its impact on the practice of law. Happily, I myself pretty much avoided computers while I was working, but they were coming right on the heels of when I left. Maybe that was one of the reasons I did leave. But now I have to admit, I travel with a laptop and keep in touch with my children by email, but I think he would have had a good deal of trouble with that. I can't imagine him doing research on a computer and reading materials off a monitor screen. Oh, I guess you could print them too, but you won't read them first, I guess, before you print them. Robert Jackson was interested in every aspect of the law, which he viewed as the fabric holding civilized society together, with society's support, of course. Along with the law as such, he was intensely interested in the judiciary, to which society has delegated the authority to administer the law. His interest in the judiciary necessarily carried with it an interest in all aspects of government. You see these interests of his throughout his extensive writings, not just in his court opinions, but also in his books, his articles, and in his speeches. The justice was, of course, an outstanding writer. If not the best, certainly one of the best on the court in the 20th century. His model, he once told me, was the King James Version of the Bible. One of the reasons his opinions read so well is that all were first written out by hand on a yellow legal pad. He would sit and write them all out in the yellow pad, then give them to his secretary to type up. He did that for everything. And you see, you craft things much more tightly when you do that. And Justice Jackson wrote his own opinions. In some offices, the law clerks did most of the opinion writing, but not in his. On 2 occasions, maybe 3, I did manage to write opinions for him. These came about not because he asked me to, but because he was out of the city when the opinion assignments came down from the office of the Chief Justice. I seized the opportunity to try my own hand at opinion writing. Now, these were not, as you might guess, landmark cases by a long shot. I was pleased that he read my drafts, which I had on his desk when he returned to the office. And I was even more pleased when he accepted them pretty much as is and signed off on them. Several weeks after these opinions were handed down, along came petitions for rehearing. And I remember with the occasion of the first such petition, he came into my office, took us in my office and said, handed me his copy of the rehearing petition. He said, "Here, George, you can see how stupid you are." Justice Jackson's almost single-minded devotion to the law meant that he was not in truth what you would call a truly well-rounded man. He had no hobby of which I am aware, except possibly reading. And even then, you can imagine what subjects attracted his attention. When he was in Jamestown, and I suppose for several years after he first went to Washington, he had a boat on the lake, which he was called the Alibi. And I believe he enjoyed it, but I've been on it myself several times. But other than horses and horseback riding and fishing, he liked to fish. He really did not have any interest in sports. One time in the Washington Post, an article appeared this given morning that said Robert H. Jackson was being considered as the next commissioner of baseball. And my fellow clerk at that time was John Cushman from Cornell. And so we asked him when he came in, we said, how about this business of you being commissioner of baseball? He said, what? I said, yes, the paper says you may be commissioner of baseball. He said, you know, I don't even know one field from the other. And you know what? I believe him. He just, those things didn't interest him. He didn't seem to have any interest in music, art, or the theater. At least he never talked about them. He did comment to me about one painting at one time. He again stuck his head in my office and asked me if I had seen the huge painting of Washington crossing the Delaware that hangs halfway up the one side of the stairs in the House chamber. And I acknowledged that I had. He said, well, you've seen prints of the picture with a little fellow hunched down to one side with Washington standing up there. He said, but George, you know what that little fellow's saying? I said, well, I can't guess. Well, I have it on good authority that was saying, sit your fat bum down, George. You're rocking the boat. One testament to the level of his scholarship was his close relationship with Mr. Justice Frankfurter. Now, believe me, I'm not trying to be a name dropper, but everyone who worked with or was associated at all with Justice Frankfurter called him behind his back Felix. Well, Felix often came in to see Justice Jackson, and when he did, he came via the clerk's office. And of course, he didn't just come to the door and then keep walking. He'd stop and chat for a while. He loved to do that because he liked young people, and he was always, forever the professor. But he'd ask us about something, and he was a bouncy little man like this. And he'd start to try to remember an opinion. And then he'd start to whistle, and he'd go over. We had the U.S. report sitting on one wall. He'd go over and he'd start talking about who the lawyer was that argued the case. He couldn't remember the name of the case, but he could remember who argued it. But in that way, I came to know Justice Frankfurter very well too. And that was certainly a plus. In fact, I've twice been to dinner at Justice Frankfurter's home, in the lovely home in Georgetown. He always had, at the end of the term, he'd have his own clerks. There would be two, then maybe three or four, maybe four others whom he liked. And I was fortunate enough to be included in that group twice. The dinner was followed by brandy and cigars, and it was always an excellent meal. But when we got to the brandy and cigars, then the conversation would start. And I remember the very first time Felix, looked at me down the table and said, well, George, what was the best opinion of the term and why? I said, who, me? And well, then he'd go down, what was the poorest opinion of the year and why? And those conversations were absolutely delightful. Felix, although he could be abrupt, Felix was always courteous with the clerks. I genuinely appreciated the opportunity to know him. Even after I left the court, we continued to correspond a bit. Not a whole lot, but a bit. I hope I am not leaving you with the impression that Justice Jackson was a dull or tedious man. given his single-minded devotion to the law. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was perhaps the most affable man I ever met. He loved parties, although he and Mrs. Jackson certainly did not do the Washington party circuit. He had a marvelous sense of humor, loved to tell a story, and he was good at telling stories. He not infrequently hosted receptions in one of the court's large reception halls, which you see go down the center corridor, turn to the left. On each side there are these large halls, and he would have reception for one kind or another in there fairly often. Now, these affairs were usually occasioned by a bar association activity of some kind. He liked the bar associations. Even as a justice, he used to go to the ABA meetings every year. He told me once that he tended to favor the public utility law section because it had the best parties. At these receptions of his, the justice's messenger, Harry Parker, was the designated bartender. I undertook to help Harry out when it appeared that help was in order. On one such occasion, while I was tending bar, the justice brought over to meet me Sir Norman Burkitt, who was the alternate judge for Great Britain in the major Nazi war trials, and had come somehow to know Jackson very, very well there, and they had become quite close friends. Sir Norman was a major figure in England's legal hierarchy. In fact, he wrote the foreword to Eugene Gerhardt's biography of Jackson. Anyway, Justice Jackson introduced me to Sir Norman in this fashion. Norman, I'd like you to meet my law clerk, George Niebank. He is the one responsible for all my mistakes. Then he added, and I want you to note, Norman, that the young men in my office come to know both sides of the bar. Now, having touched on Nuremberg, I must turn to it for a moment. It was, I'm sure, the peak of his performance as an advocate. I was in his office only 4 years after the conclusion of the trials, and the matter was still very fresh in his memory. He did not talk about it a great deal, although he certainly was not reluctant to do it. We just had other things to talk about. At one point, though, I had been reading some of the criticism of the trial, and I asked him point blank what his response was to the ex post facto argument that you read quite a good deal. You read fairly frequently. He answered that murder had been for centuries a crime in all civilized societies, that no one would have blamed the Allies for standing the major Nazis up in front of a wall and shooting them. But it was, he said, better to prove their guilt in a courtroom, and then in that manner establish precedent for the future. As you all know, it has done that. As witness, the war crimes trial is now taking place at The Hague. Justice Jackson came away from the Nuremberg trials with a heightened awareness of national security matters. Now, I have done little more this evening than scratch the surface of the Robert H. Jackson story. I know he would be delighted that you have chosen to honor him in this way on the occasion of the 100th of the centennial celebration of the Jamestown Bar Association. And I, once again, am pleased to have been invited to share this evening with you. And I want to thank you for your courteous attention. Good evening.
I haven't garnered that much applause since I birdied the 18th in the old course at St. Andrews.
Thanks for coming. George, Mr. Niebank, thank you very much for coming. Thank you all for coming. I believe the bar is still open if you'd care to have one final, one for the ditch, I guess. And one of my business cards as you leave. It'll be a nice time to maybe socialize just for a few minutes before we leave. Again, I want to thank my ad hoc de facto committee, which we put together really on the phone. Greg, were it not for the fact that I have absolutely no need for ego gratification, I'd be jealous of the fact that you've did such a wonderful job in bringing Mr. Niebank here, and thank you all for coming.